Hello, today you will be watching me create a Halloween inspired card using some Tim Holtz products that I had in my stash. I started by gathering some browns and stains, some inks, and re-inkers that I spread on my craft mat, and I dipped my cardstock into to create like a wash over top of my paper so it wasn't white. So I just have regular watercolor paper that I cut to make a layer for my card. And after I smushed it around in the inks, I took my heat tool and I dried the ink on the paper just to speed up the process a little bit. So now I'm done and I'm wiping up my mess. And you can see that the paper has the ink dried on it, and I'm ready to move on to the next step, which is taking my re-inkers and making a little bit of a different color and more of like a textured look to my paper. I like using my re-inkers for this process as well because it's a little bit more of a concentrated color, even though I use a whole lot of water this time and really dull it down because I really didn't want to have any dark concentrated spots on my paper. So you see me really getting it wet. So I'm doing the same thing here and just kind of smushing my paper into the ink spot, and I'll take my heat tool and I'll dry it again and just help it along. So after I'm happy with how my paper looks, I clean up my area a little bit and I pull out the next bit of media I'm going to be using, which is Tim Holtz's collage paper. I've never used it before, so this is the first time. I actually got this was part of the Halloween release, and I'm super excited about how it turned out. I think it's really awesome. So I just cut a piece of the flower off of it that I know that I wanted to have as a focal point, and I'm using just a little bit of a medium gel matte paste to put it down to my paper. So I just spread a thin layer of my collage paste on the base of my card, and then I lay the collage paper down and I put another light layer of the collage medium on top of my tissue paper. And now I'm just cutting off the excess, and like that, I have an awesome little flower put on my page. So I like the way the flower looks so much, I couldn't stop there. So I got another piece of what I cut off and I kind of just tore around the lace and added a bit of the lace to my background as well. So I'm doing the same process here, putting a thin layer down, putting my collage tissue down, and then another layer of the paste on top just to make sure it's good and in place. So I just went and did another light layer over top of the whole background, where I had the tissue paper laid down, just to make sure that it was a nice even coverage. I trimmed off the excess little pieces that were sticking over the sides, and I got out my heat tool and just did a quick once over to help that drying process along. And next I pulled out some stamps because I wanted to add bugs in there. So I was trying to figure out my layout. I knew I wanted the witches. I had a little dried flower that I wanted to incorporate. I just wasn't sure which bug. So I ended up stamping 2 bugs just to be safe. And I end up using them both on the card, but you'll see that later. So I'm using my stamping platform on another piece of watercolor paper just to make sure I get a nice crisp stamped image. I also grabbed some of the figure number stamps from another set, and I just stamped those out on the paper with a acrylic block because they're not as intricate as the bugs, so one stamp should be good. So once I kind of get my workspace together a little bit, I started putting little creating my palette, if you will. I put out some colors that I knew I wanted to incorporate in the bugs as well as on the background portion of my card. So I took several colors that I just like and started coloring everything in. I kind of color in and then I blot off a little bit so it's not as intense, so it's a little bit more of a desaturated color on the background image. And since it's covered in a matte medium, it was easy to kind of dilute it a little bit. So when I was happy with the paint job on my bugs and my background, I went in with a little bit of Wink of Stella and I kind of glossed over the bugs so they would have a little bit of a glitter look to them. And then I got to the fussy cutting part, which is not something that I'm going to bore you with, so I really cut out a lot. Takes a lot longer than you'd think to cut out those little bugs. I'm starting to wish I had the thinlits. Then I kind of just popped off that figure set of numbers and I went ahead and did the same thing that I did with the background of the paper just so it wasn't such a stark white piece of paper, and put some ink down on my mat, squirted it with some water and then ran it through and dried it and repeated a couple times just to get like a tea stained look. Next I grabbed a blending sponge and I started to go around the sides of all of my little pieces that I was going to add to the card. So again, it wasn't such like a white line. I even took my little sponge off and got in the little creases of the witches in between their hats and their arms. So that way there wasn't really any white lines hopefully showing. I pulled out one of these little pins because I knew that I wanted to stick that behind the bug and put the little figure number on the pin so it looked like it was a specimen that we had saved, or that these old witches saved. So here I'm just trying to figure out my layout of where I want the little figure plaque and if I want it at the top of the bug or the bottom of the bug. So I have to work that out. I also decided that the pin was a little bit too long for what I wanted, so I chopped off the sharp part and got a little piece of fun foam that I cut and glued to the back of the bug. That way he'd be popped up a little bit and create some dimension to the front of the card. So to glue everything on, I'm just using Fabri-Tac because it was right in arm's reach, and it's a pretty decent glue. Even if you're not using fabric, it dries pretty fast. So I put a little line on and pop the fun foam on, and I'm ready to add it to the front. Before I glue the bug onto the front of the card, I take my little pin and I push it into the fun foam, that way it stays in there. So I got a green distress marker and I scribbled out a little swatch so I could use it to paint these ladies green, because if Wizard of Oz has taught us anything, it's that wicked witches need to be green. So in my mind, these ladies are wicked, therefore needed to be green. So I took my paint brush and I started adding the green marker with the brush onto them, and I didn't like that it wasn't as green as I wanted, so I just took my marker, colored them, and then kind of wiped it off with my finger, and it tinted them exactly how I wanted them to be tinted. So when I was happy with that, I went on and I thought, why not add a few more colors? So I gave one of the witches a little bit of purple, I painted the broom and the dustpan, and I thought it added just enough color, but also continued my washed out look that I wanted to keep. So again, I'm taking all of the pieces that I want to incorporate on my card and figuring out how I want them exactly laid out. And I think I finally decided on the bug in that upper right corner, and the flower will be at the bottom. But it also looked a little bit too bare, so I went ahead and put some stitched lines around the border to help draw your focus in. So I looked at my layout again, and I also wanted to incorporate a wax seal in the mix here. So I thought it would be a great idea to go ahead and put a wax seal over top of my dried flower. So I laid my flower down where I wanted it and started to drip wax over top. I really love how wax seals look. I think they're really fun to watch happen when they come together. It's like magic. So when I was finally really happy with my layout, I got a piece of vellum and I put that underneath the bug just to kind of help draw the attention to the bug, because I thought it was a little bit lost up there by itself. Again, I go in with my Fabri-Tac and glue everything down. Once I'm finally happy with the placement of that figure tack, I go ahead and pop a little dot of glue on that too so it can't easily get pulled out. And I layer everything on. Next I grab the witches and I put a few lines of tape using my ATG on the back of them. I cut off a length of copper string and I want to go ahead and put that on the back of the witches. And once I'm happy with the placement of the copper string, I go ahead and I put some Fabri-Tac on the back of the witches and put them on my base. So now that I'm happy with everything on my card, I went ahead and started to distress another piece of watercolor paper just to layer on the front of that black card base. And I also ended up taking a second sheet of watercolor paper and distressing it as well. That way I could put it on the inside of my card. I decided that both of those white pieces were a little bit too plain, and I wanted something to kind of break up just the plainness of the two pieces that I just distressed. So I took some sepia archival ink and the script stamp that came with the etymology stamp set, and I just randomly placed them on my layer pieces there. I wanted to check and see how it looked, and I decided that the top layer was a little bit too big, so I trimmed a little off, and it's kind of a wonky cut, but I ended up liking the way it looked, so I just went with it. So checking it again, when I liked the width of the border, I went ahead and stamped just a little bit more of the script on the bottom of that layer. That way you could see some of the writing poking out underneath of the witches. I also wanted to bring that script stamp on the inside of the card, that way it all tied together. So I went ahead and I inked it, and then I stamped off on a plain sheet of paper, and then I stamped on the actual piece that's going in my card, so it wasn't as dark of a stamp print. So once I was happy with how everything looked, I went ahead and got everything ready to put together. So I brought out my Fabri-Tac again, put some glue on the top layer, glued that down to the second layer, Took my second layer, glued it down to my card base, and so on and so forth. Again with the glue, taking my inside layer, which ended up being a little bit too big, so I trimmed it down a little bit and put it into place. Took my extra bug and an extra figure piece, put them on the inside, and called this card done.
It's amazing. Thank you for watching.